Thank you, everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you a bit about Scottish news networks. And I want to make it clear at the beginning that this is an educated or a prototype proposal as opposed to the launch of an amazing piece of technology. So I am still open to ideas to improve as I'm creating this, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. So first thing I want to talk about is what a newspaper network is in the context of the 1780s to the 1840s. Up until the advent of telegraphy, really up until the 1880s, 1890s, the majority of information that you find in British and American newspapers has been cut and pasted from other British and American newspapers. Although many people did have correspondence, people they literally wrote letters to find information, much of the material, especially in colonial and provincial newspapers, relied on getting subscriptions from bigger and better newspapers, cutting out the interesting bits, resetting it in their own newspaper, and selling it to their local readers. So when I approach these networks, what I want to find out is who exactly they are committing scissors and paste journalism with. How are they getting their news? And how are they transmitting it, or is it stopping with them? So, how does the Georgian newspaper network work in Scotland, late Georgian, 1780s onward? Well, the reason it works so well is because there are a lot of journeyman printers, people working for the larger London newspapers, moving out into the provinces. They become very good at creating a newspaper. They want to create their own back in their home communities, in Leeds, in Exeter, in Glasgow, and Edinburgh. They're not going to rely just on the London press anymore. And the fact that the stamp duty, the tax on newspapers, is reduced several times during the 18th and early 19th century means that newspapers are much more commercially viable, so more and more keeps springing up. The reason that cut and paste or scissors and paste journalism becomes so prominent is because of new profit models. For much of the 18th century, Scottish and British newspapers were political entities. They were trying to sell a particular political point of view, and they had patronage in order to do this. But when they started to rely on subscribers, when they started to rely on advertising based on how many subscribers they had to fill their newspapers with much more diverse, entertaining content, not just political gossip from their patrons or political propaganda. So they had to get that content from somewhere. They can't afford to have correspondence in New Zealand or America or Asia, so they have to get that material from other publications who have better resources than they do. The important thing to remember, though, about the period before 1840 is that there is no telegraph. And even after 1840, the telegraph is very expensive. They're not going to use it on Aboriginal news from Australia. They're only going to use it on big wartime events. So all of the news that's transferred has to be transferred manually. Someone has to literally hand a newspaper to someone on a ship. They have to get on the ship, get off the ship, and hand it to the newspaper editor in Glasgow or Edinburgh. Someone physically has to move there. So a lot of this news is based on migration flows, people who are going to America or the Antipodes anyways to move there. So that's how these networks sort of form. Well, we've known about scissors and paste journalism for a very long time. It's actually something they joked about at the time. A New Zealand paper in 1840 apologized that its issue was out late because its new journeyman didn't know how to use scissors. So it's something that's been a joke for a very long time. But why are media historians such as myself really getting into it now? Well, that is because of the rise in digitization and computer processing power. First of all, media history has started looking at the provincial press. Historians are no longer just using the Times as the stopgap of what to get information about newspapers. But there's also large-scale digitization projects like Chronicle in America by the Library of Congress, or the British newspaper catalogue, or Trove, the Australian newspapers. So we have all these materials that we didn't have access to before without going to archives. We can view it in our own time over long periods of time. There's also a large number of early careerists. And I don't mean that earlier, younger scholars are better at computers or more interested in this, but there are quite a lot of us, and we've got to find something to do because all the old topics of studying Thomas Jefferson have kind of been done to death. And finally, the advent of crowdsourcing. The British Library recently released a huge number of maps, historical maps, and asked the general public to help reference them to Google Maps. They put a couple hundred up thinking it would take 6 to 8 months to do them. The crowdsourcing project finished in a couple of days. The amount of amateur historians, enthusiasts who want to be involved in helping historians map this data was immense. So we can actually undertake these projects even if we don't have huge teams ourselves. But you shouldn't exploit crowdsourcers, they are nice people. So I really wanted to map all of these text networks. I wanted to know how news was getting from New Zealand to Australia to India to the Cape to London and to Glasgow. And I had to think about how I was going to find that out. Most of these newspapers have very poor business records. They certainly didn't keep a diary of where they got all their sources from. So we have to do a little bit of detective work. And there are a number of textual clues that exist within the newspaper that we can find that will help us map these networks. So this little bit of article, Dreadful Massacre by the Natives of the Marquesa Islands, appeared in the Caledonian Mercury in the 1830s. And as you can see here, it has a dateline. Now normally a dateline would not be this specific, it might just say Sydney, but it tells you where the information came from. Now it's very important, the dateline says where it came from, not necessarily what it's about. This is about the Marquesas in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This is Australians reporting on it and sending the news back. You also had section markers. Now, when it said something like India or New South Wales, something quite far afield, it's usually what the section is about, any articles in there. But if it was closer to home, if it said London or Paris or Edinburgh or Glasgow, that's where the information came from. So you get news about India or France that was under the heading London because they stole it from a London newspaper. So these are ways of getting bits of information. And finally, references. From the Governor Mercury, the name of the ship, giving an idea of how they got the information from the Marquesas in the first place. So what you can do with these textual clues is you can essentially make an Excel or other spreadsheet database of where they got the information from. Institutional sources, the Sydney Gazette. Individual sources, this particular ship captain. And this particular ship captain shows up a lot. He quite likes talking to the newspapers. And geographic sources. News anywhere in the Pacific normally came through Australia first. Indicators like this. Well, that's all well and good, but the majority of newspapers are not as helpful as that particular Caledonian Mercury edition. Most of them have bad attributions, no attributions, or wrong attributions. And so we have to go and find another way of determining where they really got the information from. Now, on the left-hand side, you have Dreadful Massacre of the Natives by the Marquesa Natives, and that is from the Caledonian Mercury in Edinburgh. 3 days later, you have another Dreadful Massacre by the Natives of the Marquesa Islands, and that appeared in the Aberdeen Journal. So obviously, the news had been copied. Apparently, they wanted to make it a bit more exciting. They added another. There's not any other ever in the history of the Aberdeen Journal talking about a massacre by the natives, but there you go. So by looking at intertextual clues, looking at what information gets copied exactly, what information gets added or subtracted, if somebody makes a typographical error, they literally mistake their P's and Q's, or they misspell somebody's name, these mistakes get transferred to the person who has copied them. So you can take an original article from the Sydney Gazette, see that the Caledonian Mercury has changed it. They gave it that really terrible title. They're the only newspaper that calls it that. And then the Aberdeen Journal also uses that title. So we know that the Aberdeen Journal must have taken it from the Caledonian Mercury. The coincidence is just too strong. And there's lots of examples of this. Even things like changing the number 1, O-N-E, to a numeral 1, that gets carried on, and you can sort of map the branches, the evolution of the article. And because we've digitized so many of these newspapers, there's lots of different ways we can approach them and lots of different ways we can make use of the information in them. And this rather crude matrix demonstrate that. If it's printed, there's no machine-readable transcription. You can do a catalog, literally go page by page, listing where it said it came from, what's it about. You can do that with the digital ones as well if you want to search through it, or you can use search keywords to get all of the articles about Australia, just catalog a subsection of a certain type of news. But if you have printed newspapers, you can also just make transcriptions. And that way you can use those along the transcriptions by optical character recognition that have been done for some of the larger digital newspaper databases. So you can combine and mix and match printed, microfilm, and digitized newspapers to create these overlapping networks and crucially get a sample size that's actually worth something. The British newspaper collection, for example, says they did a good job making a representative sample, but the networks are all completely disconnected. They've not digitized the ones they stole from, so it's not really useful to me. So once you have all of these newspaper articles that you want to use, you have to code them up. You have to make them something that a computer can understand. And here's an example of my code from a newspaper I hand transcribed, whose newspaper it is, what the date was, what section it said it came under, and a transcript of the paragraphs, columns, and lines. And that way you can compare not just phrases, not just word groups, but whole paragraphs. They tended to steal a paragraph here and a paragraph there. So it's a useful tool of comparison to know what actually constituted typographically a paragraph. So now we've got all these transcriptions, we've got all of these catalogs of data. What on earth do we do with them? It's a lot of data to go through. And that's the point. I have done quite a lot of these networks manually, using my historian hunches to sort of figure out who copied from who. But the point is that these hunches actually mean something, and if we want them to be consistent, we can explain them to a computer. So we can use off-the-shelf software like Turnitin or wcopyfind to find matches and then try to work out the order ourselves. Or we can create a program that matches phrases and grammatical structure, that gives a percentage of the matching text, looks at chronological limitations. If it appeared on the same day in Edinburgh as London, it didn't come from the London paper. They're not that fast. They're not running marathons to get news up to Edinburgh. What was taken away, what was added, abbreviations, and mistakes. And all of these we can weight and tell the computer how much it's going to be worth, and we can build up a confidence of how likely one source copied from a particular version earlier on in the chronology. So just to give you a few examples of the work I've done so far, here is one. This is the Glasgow Advertiser from 1790 to 1800. And the dots on the map are what the news article was about, and the little pie charts are where the news was textually said it came from. This is from a catalog, not transcriptions. And as you can see, it's mostly blue. Almost all the news the Glasgow Advertiser, later Herald, had came from London. It's a little bit better about Canada and the US and Sierra Leone for some reason, but mostly it came through London. And this is really interesting because it makes no sense. Glasgow is a really important port. John Minnins, the editor, spent about 90 hours a week at the Tron Gate listening to ships that were coming in. He should have been able to get more direct news. But he was also a single guy running a newspaper. Maybe it was just too much hard work. Copying from London was easier. You can also map out how an individual newspaper got its news over a much longer period. This is the Caledonian Mercury from 1800 to 1830. And as you can see, Scottish letters coming in and English letters that were being reprinted are actually where it got most of its news. It liked that personal touch. So in the end, what I'm hoping to do is go beyond the textual clues of the first two graphs and develop an intertextual map to see what they actually were copying and if that matches our perceptions of how the provincial press worked in the early 19th century. And this is a diagram of Australian news and how different newspapers were connected. You can see there's a nice strong cluster around all the Whig newspapers in the early 19th century. And if we make it directional, you can see that basically if you wanted to know about Australia, you had to get someone who had a subscription to the Sydney Gazette. You knock that node out, the entire network crumbles. This one man named George, who lived in Sydney, basically controlled all the news of Australia for almost 40 years. If he didn't print it, you didn't know about it. So as my final concluding thought, I would like to, and I probably am speaking to the choir in this particular room, say that historians should not rely on coders to go code things for them. Using high-level languages such as Python, which I used for my prototype, has a very low barrier to entry. It's very understandable computer language. And we can take those implicit processes that we use to understand small-scale case studies and really expand them to understand really large and complicated networks. Thank you very much.